like you. Be strong to hold the powers of the sun. To dream, believe in strength. Now I'm the only one.
There are episodes that feel like a simple ending. And then, there are episodes that feel like a confession without words. The final episode was never just a closing chapter. From the very first second, it carried a different weight. Something unspoken, something heavy, something honest. Not because of the location. Not because of the camera angles. Not because of the dialogue. But because of the way they existed together. Jimin and Jungkook no longer appeared as two idols finishing a schedule. They appeared as two human beings, tired, unguarded, and no longer trying to keep a safe distance. And ARMY felt it instantly, even before anything truly happened. There was no dramatic background music. No emotional hook forced in the opening. Just silence. And in that silence, everything began. Silence filled with lingering glances. With touches that felt accidental, yet deeply intentional. With body language too honest to be scripted. Jimin sat closer than usual. Closer than what camera etiquette would normally allow. Close enough that their shoulders almost touched. And Jungkook didn't move away. He didn't shift his position. He didn't laugh awkwardly like he sometimes does. He didn't try to create distance. He simply stayed. As if that space, right there beside Jimin, had always been where he belonged. ARMY held their breath. Because those who have watched closely for years know this wasn't just physical proximity. This was emotional distance finally being released. Throughout the episode, Jungkook appeared quieter than usual. But it wasn't an empty quiet. It was the quiet of someone who feels safe. The quiet of someone who doesn't need to prove anything because the person beside him already understands everything, without explanations. And that person was Jimin. Jimin, usually expressive and full of words, was softer this time. His smiles lingered longer. His gaze stayed steadier. He no longer spoke to fill the silence. He spoke only when it mattered. The rest of the time, he let his presence speak. There was one moment, simple, almost invisible, that many might have missed. Jungkook was talking. His eyes weren't fully on the camera. Jimin listened, his head slightly tilted, his eyes fixed not on what Jungkook was saying, but on how he was saying it. When Jungkook finished, Jimin didn't reply right away. He just smiled. A small smile. A private smile. Not meant for the audience. A smile that said, "I know." And Jungkook saw it. In that second, his expression softened. His shoulders relaxed. His gaze dropped briefly, like someone who had just received validation he never asked for, but deeply needed. That was the moment many ARMY cried. Not because of grand gestures, but because of sincerity so rare on camera. Later, they walked side by side. Their steps weren't perfectly aligned, but their rhythm was. When Jungkook slowed down, Jimin adjusted without thinking. When Jimin stopped, Jungkook turned back before moving on. No leader. No follower. Just two people walking together. And that's when ARMY truly became hysterical, happy, emotional, overwhelmed. Because for years, fans had only pieces. Small moments. Lingering looks. Half-finished sentences. Tiny gestures collected like fragments of a larger story. And in this final episode, those fragments finally formed a complete picture. Not a confession. Not a declaration. But something far more powerful. Consistency. Then came the nighttime scene. The lighting was low. The atmosphere calm. Jungkook sat there, exhaustion visible on his face. Jimin approached quietly and sat beside him. No dramatic dialogue. No cinematic touch. Yet the space between them disappeared. Jimin leaned in. Jungkook didn't move away. Even when the camera clearly captured the angle, neither of them attempted to create distance. They chose silence. They chose comfort. And ARMY understood something deeply important. Not all intimacy requires touch. True intimacy exists in the choice to stay. The final episode felt like an answer to questions that were never spoken out loud. Why they always find their way back to each other. Why, in a world full of noise, They look most at peace when they're together. As the episode neared its end, the atmosphere grew quieter. There were no dramatic goodbyes. No promises spoken aloud. Just one last look. Jungkook turned, not toward the camera, not toward the staff, but toward Jimin. The glance was brief, but heavy, full of meaning, as if it said, "We've come this far." Jimin responded with a small nod. Not a formal one, but one filled with understanding. A nod that said, "I'm here." And then, the screen faded to black. ARMY didn't cheer immediately. Many stayed silent. Some cried quietly, because the happiness they felt wasn't explosive. It was calm. Like coming home after a long journey. The final episode promised nothing. And that was exactly why it was beautiful. Because it showed something more meaningful than promises. A bond that doesn't need to be proven. A relationship that doesn't need explanation. A connection that simply exists. And perhaps that is why ARMY were hysterically happy. Not because of what was shown, but because of what was felt. Because in a world full of speculation, one thing became undeniably clear. No matter the label, no matter the interpretation, Jimin and Jungkook choose to stay by each other's side. And for ARMY, that has always been more than enough. And when the screen finally fades to black, something lingers. Not a cliffhanger. Not a question demanding answers. But a feeling that stays quietly in the chest. The final episode does not shout its meaning. It does not ask us to believe anything extraordinary. Instead, it offers something far rarer, honesty and stillness. Two people who have shared years of noise, pressure, expectations, and cameras, choosing calm. Choosing each other's presence without explanation. This is why the moment feels so powerful. Because what ARMY witnessed was not a performance designed to convince. It was a bond that no longer needed to prove itself. The kind of connection that survives without words, without touch, without spectacle. The kind that shows itself only when two people feel safe enough to simply exist side by side. In a world where everything is dissected, analyzed, and debated, this episode gave us something gentle. It reminded us that love, whatever form it takes, does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it arrives as a shared silence. As a glance held a second longer. As a choice to stay when nothing forces you to. Jimin and Jungkook did not give ARMY answers. They gave them reassurance. That no matter how loud the world becomes, there is still a place where they find peace. That after all the stages, all the lights, all the expectations, they return to something real. And maybe that is why ARMY didn't scream at the end. They didn't need to. They smiled through tears. They sat with the warmth. They felt complete. Because some stories don't end with declarations. They end with understanding. And this one ended exactly where it always belonged. With Jimin and Jungkook choosing to walk forward, quietly, together.